Welcome to the 347th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID 19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I talk with Jeffrey Hughes and Tritibesh Day about legal regimes under pandemic conditions, with special attention today to Jordan and also to India. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch live on Twitter at the handle at US of Disaster. Today is a special COVID calls at 5:30 p.m. Korea time. You can also hear COVID calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle at US of Disaster or at COVID calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. Please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, September 29th, 2021, there are 4,765,504 deaths from COVID 19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic. I'd like to continue that now. Headline is "The Doctor Cried with Us." Mother of first Fayette student to die of COVID tells story. This was written by Valerie Honeycutt Spears and appeared in the Lexington, Kentucky Herald Leader, September 24th, 2021. 15-year-old Christopher C.J. Gordon Jr. always put other people first, and you rarely saw him not smiling, his mother, Renita Wright Gordon, said Thursday night, September 23rd. "I've never seen my baby be upset about anything," Gordon said. "He was loving and caring." CJ died at 5:56 a.m. Thursday morning in the intensive care unit of the University of Kentucky Healthcare's Kentucky Children's Hospital, where an ambulance took him on September 12th, his mother told the Herald Leader. He was the Fayette County, Kentucky Public Schools who died of COVID-19. University of Kentucky pediatricians took care of my baby. The doctor cried with us today. He was heartbroken, Gordon said. She said the medical staff caught a glimpse of her son's personality before he was sedated and were immediately taken with him. They didn't give up. They did everything. They had Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C, Gordon said. Staff at the Learning Center, the school district program where CJ attended, described him as a smart, sweet kid who made the classroom a better place. As of Monday of this week, at least 1,470 Fayette students have tested positive with COVID in the latest surge of cases this school year, with the Republican led General Assembly giving school officials much less leeway to close school buildings to curb the virus. The Herald Leader reported that the number of coronavirus patients filling intensive care unit beds and breathing on ventilators in Kentucky has yet to plateau. Only 130 adult ICU beds were open across Kentucky on Thursday of last week. A total of 2,223 people are hospitalized with COVID 19. 625 are in an ICU, and 424 are on a ventilator in the state. 21 children are hospitalized with the virus, 8 are in an ICU, and 5 are on a ventilator. As Gordon said, she and her son both began to show signs of COVID around September 1st. She doesn't know who got it first or where they got it, only that she had been as careful as possible and they always wore masks. Other than being overweight, CJ hadn't been diagnosed with a specific pre existing condition. They quarantined at home together. CJ was winded when he walked down the stairs, though he otherwise fared well at first. Gordon said the coronavirus left her exhausted, but it was her son's condition that rapidly declined on September 12th. She called an ambulance when he fell back slowly on her bed and had difficulty talking. CJ was sedated and placed on a ventilator soon after arriving at the hospital. Gordon was still in quarantine, so at first, CJ's father went to the hospital to be with him. Doctors told her he was a very sick boy with a low oxygen level. When Gordon recovered from COVID, she stayed by his side at the hospital. CJ appeared to improve at times in the last 10 days, but he never truly rallied. Gordon said she did not force him to get the COVID vaccine because he wasn't ready to take it, and it was new to everybody. Gordon said she will get vaccinated now. Gordon said her son, a sophomore, loved University of Kentucky football and basketball and was especially a fan of UK basketball coach John Calipari. CJ played football for local city teams for several years. He was the baby of the family, doted on by his older siblings. He loved his video games and he wanted to build his own computer. People were beginning to say that one day he would make money from his computer skills. At school, he was building a reputation as a thoughtful hard worker with a bright future. I had, Gordon said, an amazing child. I know he's with God. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today. This is one I've really been looking forward to, and we've had to reschedule it once. I'm really glad that my guests have been patient with me, and let me introduce you to them. Tritibesh Day is a final year PhD candidate in the anthropology of science and technology at the University of Exeter. His broader research themes involve plastics, process, technologies of plastic waste management, and infrastructures. His thesis, due for submission this year, is a careful ethnographic study of the different processes of plastic and practical networks, including informal recycling and a combustion-based large-scale national infrastructure of solid waste management being developed in India. Conceptually, it examines mutability as a tool to study plastics' complex ubiquity. My second guest is Jeffrey Hughes. Jeffrey Hughes is a lecturer in anthropology at the University of Exeter and associate editor of the Journal of Legal Anthropology. His work explores how people in the contemporary Middle East are responding to new technologies for large-scale population management. He's written a number of articles on various social engineering projects in Jordan. His new book is entitled Kinship, Islam, and the Politics of Marriage in Jordan, Affection and Mercy. Tritibesh Day and Jeffrey Hughes, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
I'd like to start the way I generally do, just to find out where you're calling in from and what the pandemic situation looks like there. Tritibesh, let me start with you on that question.
So I was resident in Exeter for, well, until the last week, and I just reached Calcutta. In India, the number of cases has subsided in comparison to what it was a few months earlier, say when the second wave had peaked back in April, and we were having about 0.4 million COVID cases every day. Now it's much lower. We have about 25 to 30,000 cases every day. But when distributed over a large country, of course, it's uneven distribution, but in terms of every day, we do not perceive the same quantum of threat as people used to earlier. So when I go out for my evening walks every day, I find a lot of people on the streets. Most of them are wearing masks, some under their nose, some under their chin. But yeah, I mean, things look slowly getting back to normal. Speaking of the economy, it's still kind of in bad shape, but things should pick up. How about you, Jeff?
All right. Muted myself there for a second. Sorry about that. I just want one quick follow-up to you, Tritibesh. What about the vaccination situation there?
So I think they got about 86 crore, which is roughly 80 million. Yeah, so they got 86 crore vaccinations done, at least the first dose. Of course, for a big country, it's still slow in terms of the percentage vaccinations. We got a population of 140 crores. So, and 86 have got their first doses. So nearly about 60% over there. Uh, the process is uneven, but the rate has picked up.
Hmm.
I mean, I think yesterday they administered some 10 million doses of vaccine. So it's
Hmm.
picking up. It's picking up.
Hmm.
Looks so good.
Okay. Well, considering where things were even just 60 days ago, this is a very different report from what we were hearing. So still grim statistics, but a different trajectory. Thank you for that introduction. Jeffrey, same question to you. How's it looking there? And where are you and how's it looking?
Yeah, so I'm in a relatively rural area. I guess I live in a college town actually, and so we've just gone back to school. The case rate has not been, sort of spiking in the same way it had previous times when they relaxed the restrictions. It's been much more of a gradual upswing, and then since classes started back up, there's been a notable sort of uptick as well. This is obvious, I think, largely due to the vaccination rollout, which has been relatively successful in the UK. So I think that we're kind of creeping up now, I think, towards 70% vaccination. And that's basically not allowing young people to get the vaccine. So it's a much higher rate of vaccination when you basically factor out those people. So at this point, what it seems like is that most people have probably either been vaccinated or they've already had it some other way, especially if they're younger or, they were in school or sort of things like that. And so what we're seeing is sort of very little in the way of mask wearing. I'm definitely, sort of one of the few people wearing a mask, I guess, when I teach. They are supposed to be doing it, but obviously I can't make them. And about, based on my email inbox anyway, about, sort of 5 to 10% of them are self-isolating with COVID on any given day. But they don't seem to really, sort of take that very seriously. So I just keep wearing my N95 and getting a little bit of a cardio respiratory workout, sort of talking for 2 hours. But, otherwise, it's definitely nowhere near as grim as it was sort of in the last couple of waves that we've had.
And that vaccination availability, so it's universally available in the UK at this point from age 13 up, or is it 18 up, or do you know?
I believe the cutoff at this point is 15, or it might be
Okay.
16.
Okay.
But it is not. They're not allowing even sort. I mean, it's definitely higher than it is in the U.S. And I know they're thinking about lowering it even more in the U.S. But and also, of course, I mean, the sort of the buy-in from the public has been a lot higher. I think notably the Murdoch press in the UK has been very pro-vaccine compared to their coverage in the US. So it's interesting to see the same media conglomerate taking different editorial lines in different countries like that. And we could be cynical and wonder if it has to do with the fact that there's a conservative government in power in the UK and a more liberal government in the US. But, who knows, right?
Always staking out that opposition position in order to sell the news. That's the first time I've heard someone frame it that way, Jeff. So now you got to follow up with an essay on just that provocation, because I think it's actually quite interesting the ways that in Fox News, the United States has framed not only the pandemic, but more particularly in the last, let's say, 4 months, vaccination, which has moved to the maybe it's not right at the center, but it's almost at the center of Republican politics in many states across the United States. And of course, it's stoked by Fox Corp. So good observation there for sure. Thanks for that introduction. Let me stay with you for a second, Jeff. I've been asking guests if they wouldn't mind sharing a memory of the pandemic. It's the impossible task in some ways to bring it down to one memory, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing something.
Yeah, I was really struggling, and I couldn't actually make up my mind which COVID anecdote I wanted to go with until right now. So I'm just going to, I guess, have to sort of, point randomly at my sort of, sort of bank of COVID stories. So I think that probably for me, there was this moment during the really bad winter wave, right? This was after everybody had, thought it was all over. And then it sort of came back roaring with a vengeance. And this was, of course, after the infamous Eat Out to Help Out initiative from the first wave, where they basically sort of paid people to eat in restaurants, but you could only get the sort of the money if you actually ate in the physical restaurant. So this was sort of it was getting really bad, and I looked around and I realized that there were people wearing masks in cars, and this was such a sort of a shock for me because I had remembered, when my partner and I started wearing masks back in March. And people would look at us on the street, not, just sort of like we were sort of crazy, and then, I remember being in a medical humanities reading group and having a doctor over the summer swearing up and down that the masks couldn't possibly be helpful, and were probably actually making it worse. And then, sort of to see that kind of buy-in on the masking at that particular moment. Now, of course, that didn't last, which I think is another part of the story, interestingly. So there seems like a real interesting sort of tension around there, around ideas of vulnerability and risk, and what would constitute an effective mitigation strategy.
If you don't mind me asking, you made that sort of adoption of the mask early on. Did you know something about masks as a sort of non-therapeutic intervention with pandemic, or how did you come to that? Because I was a little slow myself, and I bought some masks online in January, and I didn't use them. I just sort of kept them. They were a sort of a psychological prophylactic device that I kept, but didn't adopt it until many other colleagues had already done so. I wonder how you came to that.
Yeah, so I mean, I was kind of going on the basis of the idea that the people who have the most experience with coronaviruses would probably have the best mitigation strategies. And so the fact that it was endemic to East Asia and that the East Asian focus was so heavily weighted towards ventilation and airflow and things like that, I just sort of very early on got this idea in my head that it was probably being transmitted through the air rather than through surfaces. And it really seems like that is not really sort of sunk in, even in the UK up till now. I'll see students sort of walking into buildings and sort of very carefully using the hand sanitizer and then avoiding the masks. And, they're still wiping down surfaces. They're still even telling people sort of on, sort of public service announcements I hear on Spotify in the morning when I'm running, that you should be, sort of paying attention to surfaces. And they have now started talking about making sure there's fresh air. But the whole etiology of the pandemic seems like it sort of has there's been a lot of sort of national and regional differences in terms of how people are willing to think about that.
Tridivesh, let me come to you with the same question, if you wouldn't mind sharing a memory that sticks in your mind about this period of time.
So Jeff and I were both resident in this small semi-rural town of Exeter in the southwest of the United Kingdom. And we had a lot of overlapping experiences of the pandemic, of course, and we're also neighbors of sorts. Now, I mean, I'm sure, so let me just I had to think about which anecdote I wanted to share. And I think what I wanted to talk about is this very compounded and multi-sided experience of the pandemic, especially for academics, or especially those of us in early career in academics who have our lives very internationally distributed, right? We've got immediate family somewhere, we've got friends somewhere, and we are somewhere else. So the perception of the pandemic, the variable perceptions of risk, the responsibilities and caring duties are always kind of distributed, and a very fragmented experience as humanity as a whole kind of chugs along in this pandemic path. The memory that stands out for me most prominently involves a super cyclone which hit the Gangetic Delta region of India, where most of my family and my partner are resident, and where I currently am right now. One of the strongest super cyclones to hit the region, only the fifth since 1582. One of the costliest of cyclonic storms, and I've actually got a screenshot here, if I'm able to share the screen with you.
Should be able to. There's a share function there if you want to use it. And
am I able to share the screen?
Should be able to. if you share, and then it'll ask you which, if you want to share from a tab. There we go. Might just take a second here. Bear with us 1 second, everyone.
There you
We'll
go.
just. There we are. What an image.
So this most prominent memory is when I was monitoring the cyclone as it was hovering over the region. Yeah. So, and this was basically the very visual and virtual experience of my going through the pandemic, when I know that my immediate family is in this region where the eye of the storm is right now. I mean, you can see in the region. So just, like there was this one 12-hour window when all mobile phone signals were closed, and we eventually lost touch with everybody and not knowing what's going on really. My family are quite better placed in comparison, but there are millions of people who lost their homes. Close to 5 million people evacuated, at least 100 people dead. And it's also one of the costliest cyclones in the region. I was just reading the figures. I mean, of course, financial sum is hardly a measure of the quantum of damage in individual and public life for that region. But yeah, I mean, quite an interesting experience, I think, because as a lot of disasters kind of layer over each other, and of course the pandemic, and this happened in May last year, during the peak of the first wave of the pandemic, and as one would imagine, like how the protocol of physical distancing, mask wearing, etc., would complicate the work of relief, the work of evacuation, and so on, and especially for millions of people who have been rendered homeless for weeks and months following the onslaught of the storm. Of course, staying at home and the usual tenets are unavailable.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that and that experience of being on one continent, worrying about family in another continent, the breakdown of communications. That's a powerful one. I just want to remind everybody you're listening to COVID Calls, and talking today to Tridivesh Day and Jeffrey Hughes. And we're going to turn now to another facet of our conversation to talk about a project that they just finished, special issue of the Journal of Legal Anthropology on legal regimes under pandemic conditions. And I'm going to put the link up to that here in just a second, and I tweeted it out. It's a beautiful collection, and Jeff, you have an introduction in it. I'm just going to quote one sentence from it, but let me just give this quote. You talk about a conjecture. You talk about having a conjecture of virus and diverse legal orders, which offers rich material for anyone struggling to understand how institutional and normative frameworks operate in various corners of the contemporary world. So this is deeply transnational, deeply comparative, deeply ethnographic in a time in which we can't really do ethnography in the way that we're supposed to be able to do it. I love it. I think it's great, and excited to hear you talk about. First, Jeff, let me start with you, how you came to the idea, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the conceptual apparatus that you're invoking here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and I'm glad that you found it useful and generative. I think that this is a regular aspect of the journal, as we have these fora, which is not so much for sort of a standard peer review article, but it's more of a sort of an informal opportunity for scholars to talk about sort of important current events. So obviously, I think that when the pandemic arose, I felt like it was one of the most exciting opportunities to sort of do a forum that we've encountered in a while. Of course, if anyone listening has a good idea for a forum, we're always excited to hear about your ideas as well. So you can get in touch with me about that if you don't mind me making that plug. Yeah, I mean, so basically, from my perspective, right, as someone who is a sort of a long time STS, or a real interest in science and technology studies going back to my undergraduate and graduate studies. But also, of course, seeing the sort of the relationship between science and technology on the one hand and law on the other is really crucial to the way that both of those fields are constituted. The pandemic offered, such an exciting opportunity. I mean, obviously, amidst all of the sort of the horrific aspects of it, to really sort of interrogate, what we could sort of make of our contemporary world. And I think that the fact that the virus is ostensibly the same thing, right? And yet, as it enters all of these different fields, it's going to move and behave very differently. And there's going to be these very interesting looping effects, where the way in which it's perceived and the way in which pre-existing frameworks are going to dictate how the virus can be perceived is then going to sort of create different sorts of path dependencies in terms of how societies are going to try and cope with it. It seemed to me that this was a really good opportunity for comparative work, and that this sort of called for some sort of empirical response from anthropologists, that it was a good opportunity to bring people together from different parts of the world. And then we could start to see how even something as, sort of concrete and uniform as what's effectively, sort of a ball of proteins that are sort of self-replicating, can have radically different effects, on different communities based on all of the sort of that cultural and social stuff that makes us so different, but also, of course, defines us as humans.
One of the things that is often said as kind of a truism about disaster research is that disasters reveal, disasters show. I remember the first time I read that. In fact, I remember exactly where I was the first time I read that. And it's this aha moment for disaster researchers in which they see disasters as revelatory, pulling back the curtain, whatever metaphor you want to use, to show social orders and legal orders as they are. But you point to something else in the introduction to this special issue, that they also generate new orders. And so in that sense, the disaster is not inert. It's also provocative. And I wonder if I could draw you out a little bit on how you see that.
Yeah, so I really have to thank Tritabesh here for bringing together this idea of a binding crisis, which I think I was vaguely aware of, but I think Tritabesh was the person who really put this front and center in my mind. And I think that his excellent ethnography of plastics and waste management in India is sort of a really fantastic example, right, of how, I mean, obviously this is, in some sense, this is the classic, sort of Naomi Klein, who is, of course, drawing on Milton Friedman, sort of never let a good crisis go to waste. But, I think that there's a sort of a less cynical read on this as well, right, which is that these crises and disasters, they sort of reveal pre-existing vulnerabilities. And then, I mean, sort of take the paradigmatic example of a binding crisis, right, which was also, of course, epidemiological, which was the cholera epidemic that led to the basically re-engineering of waste management, and especially, sort of sewage systems in London in the 19th century. That oftentimes when we, sort of begin to look at the state of our world in the aftermath of these sort of terrible events, we realized that we could actually be doing things in, I mean, if not a better way, at least a different way that would have different sorts of problems, different sorts of opportunities. And that it's precisely in these sort of moments of crisis that we often see new sort of orders emerging. And so again, right, this is a sort of makes this a very rich opportunity for anthropological investigation.
Tritabesh, let me bring you in on that, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the case that you contributed for this special issue.
Right. So I basically talk about this ongoing process of formalization in solid waste management in India, and kind of looking at the emergency rules that were put in place to govern the pandemic, of course, and how that kind of reframes, re-narrativizes, revalues different regimes of work when it comes to picking up plastic waste or treating plastic waste or inducting plastic waste in all sorts of networks, processes, and evaluations. So in a way, yes. So the central argument is how kind of this pandemic is used as a method to re-intensify that process of formalization in view of all the resistances and competitions that this large-scale incineration-based waste management infrastructure faces. Um, in reality, it's hardly a case of competition because there are multiple processes in which plastic waste is foraged and it's reintegrated into different processes and networks, right? So on one hand, you have the recycling processes, you have different smaller scale reuse circles. Then, of course, there is the larger scale, um, the more the one which the government is most interested in is kind of large scale induction of plastic and then channelizing them to pretty big incineration based waste to energy systems, almost like killing two birds with one stone. You kind of have this big waste crisis, this large country with big population, and on the hand, which also have the energy crisis. So then, kind of aspirationally dealing with both these issues by turning waste into energy theoretically. And of course, like I've explored this in other works, and I kind of touched upon this in the empirical case study, which I presented in this special issue, is how this new regime of incineration kind of marginalizes and dispossesses these more informal networks of recycling, which are also um, um, managed. And I mean, these are enterprised by informal urban poor populations. They're quite efficient and they're also sources of livelihood for a lot of the urban poor. So the pandemic kind of, I mean, in framing the laws, the recycling enterprises and practices of foraging were prohibited and were not deemed essential. Um, and on the other hand, the more formal regime of waste collection and circulation into the incinerators was in fact promoted as its essential labor and performed very visually in the sense that the authorized municipal workers almost have this rite of passage to public space under lockdown, whereas those who are visibly marked different, that is, they're not wearing uniforms or carrying ID cards, are basically policed out of the public space, which is also their site of work and source of livelihood. So that's basically the case, kind of how the pandemic emerges as this neoliberal method of structuring and formalizing a particular industry, a particular regime of creating value, creating privatized value from public commodity, essentially.
Thank you for that description. And I should just give a shout out to a graduate student who's here at KAIST, where I am, Hyuna Kyum, who's also working on a master's thesis about the case of plastic waste during the pandemic here in South Korea. And there's some really fascinating overlaps with your story, Tridivesh. And it's a case where you had a sort of set of legal decisions which had been made quite recently, just before the pandemic, and then the pandemic forces a reevaluation of those and an improvisation in that moment. And that poor performativity of the state saying, this is COVID waste now, so it means something different now. And owning that, and I'm not doing this justice, she'll have to explain it to you, and I'll be sure to connect you. But that's really powerful. It seems to be part of the story that you're telling as well. Let me follow up, Jeff, and ask you. You wrote about Jordan and the case of Jordan in your essay, and there's a lot to it. But maybe I'll just open the opportunity.
And actually, I think reading the plastic waste.
Hold that, Jeff. We'll come right back to you in a second. Tridivesh, go ahead.
Sorry, no. So I was just saying, I mean, the plastic waste crisis, of course, is the tip of the iceberg with plastics under the pandemic. Um, I, I mean, there's a small plug, but it's quite relevant, I think, because there's this one short piece that Michael and I co-authored with for Discover Society, the sociological review blog. It basically talks about how the plastic industry kind of re-narrativized uh, the utilitarian value of single-use plastics over reusable and recyclable shopping bags, and how interestingly the deployment of single-use devices within the medical setting was kind of cited as a life-saving solution for other spheres of private and public life, and how this kind of notion that, well, and of course this data on surface persistence of the coronavirus, which emerged in March, April last year, and how this scientific data was kind of spun in a very problematic way to kind of say that, hey, okay, so plastics, so the virus persists on plastics. So instead of reusing plastics, we need to have single-use plastics which are easily disposable. And it's of course the abundance of plastic which enables this. Yeah, I mean, rather than not using or reusing or generating reuse and recycling infrastructures. So I think, and of course we see a lot of effects of these very strategic deployments of fear of contagion and public responsibility in the reversal of the plastic bans and the single-used policies being reversed on various states in the US, but also in Europe for some time.
It's such an important set of observations because early on in the pandemic, during the lockdown phase, global sort of lockdown phase, there was a lot of, I think, important thinking about the environmental impact of lockdown, but most of that was in terms of power consumption and in terms of greenhouse gas emission, and much less on the waste side of things. And so I'm glad that you're intervening on that side. Jeff, let me bring you in and talking about what you observed in the way that Jordan dealt with the pandemic. I know it had impacts in terms of more informal social things around hospitality, but also quite formal efforts that the government went to provide food, for example.
Yeah, so this also is, I guess, very important in terms of why I started to think about a comparative project on legal and state responses to the pandemic, right? So, like we've said, there were lockdowns in many parts of the world. Jordan, being a relatively small kingdom in the Middle East, I think was going to always have its own sort of spin on it. And there were aspects of the sort of that response that I just were so sort of characteristically Jordanian to me, that I thought that they really drew out some of the social and cultural specificities of that particular society and the social settlement in that country. So the most, I think, iconic moment for me was when they began their lockdown by, and I think this was very much in keeping with Jordan's, sort of formation and a lot of the sort of the counterinsurgency logics that often are at play in a place like Jordan in terms of just the urban infrastructure and things like that. So there's a highly militarized response, sort of moving in to urban centers and sort of cutting off, sort of points of access, and then basically sort of setting up checkpoints, which is another sort of very characteristic thing, impounding anyone who is driving without a good reason to. And then as part of this really sort of intense lockdown that they attempted, they had this idea that they would basically provide food and very characteristically bread to the entire country. So they basically had this idea that they could basically turn the transportation structure backwards, right? And instead of sort of bringing people in to sort of earn their daily bread, they could basically sort of have all of the buses and taxis basically ferrying bread, to the people, right? So the government, in a certain sense, was playing into sort of basically decades of what one of my colleagues, Martinez, has called the politics of bread in Jordan, right? Oftentimes, political legitimacy and social disorder is articulated in the idiom of bread, and the regime's ability to provide literal bread to its citizens is one of the main sort of basis for its legitimacy. And if you read the work of my colleague Martinez, you can read all about the sort of labyrinthine system of subsidies and sort of state support that they use to make it so that you can basically buy a kilo of bread for, about 20 pence or about 20 cents on the kilo. So it was, this of course turned out to be a little bit grandiose, and they weren't actually able to sort of do this in practice. People crowded around the streets, sort of major sort of thoroughfares, because they didn't trust the government to get to their particular house. But it sort of, to me, it was indicative of a particular kind of state imaginary, which very much runs counter to our idea of what sort of the neoliberal consensus would suggest. And it pointed to the fact that maybe beneath the surface of what we might call the Washington consensus, that there are sort of alternative state imaginaries that persist, and that the pandemic was actually bringing to the surface ideas about the role of the state in society that had previously laid rather dormant.
Just to follow up on that, how did the media cover that? What was the framing around this idea that, because the way you suggested is quite provocative. It's like you usually work for your daily bread, but now we need you to stay. Your work is to stay home for your daily bread. But in either scenario, the state is playing a formative role. But in this one, it's that you need to be at home to receive the bread.
Exactly. Yeah. So I thought that was a very interesting aspect of it. I think that it was somewhat articulated around work, but I also think very interestingly that it wasn't necessarily conditioned on work in that same way. So I think that there is a longstanding idea, and I think this maybe also plays into notions of hospitality, and also the notion of the monarchy itself as a sort of a royal house, and Jordan itself is basically a house in which the sort of the king has a sort of a paternalistic role. That sort of your ability to get your daily bread isn't necessarily predicated on your status as a worker, but rather as a sort of an obedient son of the nation, perhaps, would be how I would maybe put it a little bit more, right? So I think it was maybe more conditioned on compliance than it was on labor per se, which I think says a lot also about how the regime perceives itself, and also how basically Jordanian citizens, through decades of political struggle, often quite contentious, have basically forced the regime to make certain basic concessions about its responsibilities to its populations. These aren't necessarily articulated in the idiom of democratic rights or representation, but rather in a much more concrete idiom of what we might call the politics of the belly.
I noted in today's statistics, and I'd be curious to know what you think about health reporting in Jordan. 10,703 deaths reported as of now in Jordan. And so I guess my question there is first of all about how health reporting works in the country, and how comfortable you are with those numbers. And I guess following up on that, have there been moments of crisis, maybe exemplified by certain incidents that have caught people's attention throughout this pandemic in Jordan?
Yeah. So there have been two waves, and I think in general Jordan had a very quick response, and they pursued a suppression strategy at first, what my friends called the Chinese model, Nizam as-Sini, as they said. And so it was pretty militarized. Again, it had this sort of counterinsurgency logic to it. And they were able to basically sort of not really have a wave until November, which was, I guess, not bad for a relatively poor and small country. Now, in terms of how much we can trust those death figures, it's hard to say. I generally think that the Jordanian medical profession is very, very competent. They export doctors all around the region, all around the world, in fact. They're definitely highly skilled, highly trained. I've gotten incredible medical care in Jordan. So I would think that if it was up to the medical professionals, I would trust those numbers completely. There might be some fudging, of course. I have no idea. I don't have any reason to believe that. One of the other things, of course, that might explain Jordan's relative success, other than its quick response and sort of the competence of the medical profession in general, is the fact that it's such a young country. So the median age, this might have changed a little bit, but at least in recent years, the median age is 27, right? And this just reflects an incredibly high birth rate, right? So when we talk about a country of, say, maybe 7 million people, we're talking about the vast majority of those people being relatively young, right? And a very small number of people who are elderly, right? So I think that part of the reason why Jordan may have dodged a bullet over and above any sort of competence on the part of the professional class of the country, it would have to do with a small population. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been some moments of crisis and some moments when the regime's credibility was actually deeply called into question by its pandemic response. And I think that probably the most spectacular aspect of this, which I think even reached the Western media because it was such a big blow up. And I don't think people quite understand how this incident began, right? But I think some people may have heard of how there was a coup attempt or an alleged coup attempt, I should say, in Jordan by one of the country's princes. And a lot of this actually probably dates back to the Trump administration, and it's possible that he was in some sort of contact with the Trump administration that he should not have been in. But the immediate precipitating event was that there was a hospital in the country, which was very new. It had been basically built by, I believe, USAID had helped, and so it had all the latest equipment. It was a very nice facility, and there was basically no reason why there should be any problems. But due to alleged incompetence and corruption on the part of the hospital staff, they basically ran out of oxygen. And I believe 7 people died as a result of this loss of oxygen. So this was a major scandal, of course. The families were outraged. There were protests. They, of course, held the hospital management personally responsible. And the hospital management was put on trial, in fact. But in the aftermath of this event and amidst all this outrage, this prince went to meet with the grieving families. And this was seen as a sort of a real challenge to the legitimacy of the king, because this was, of course, in March. This was their second lockdown, second wave. And I think there was a lot of anger and frustration. And to have that sort of a major failure was seen as a big scandal.
Just a reminder that you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking today to Jeffrey Hughes and Tridivesh Day. I just want to question to both of you, and Jeff, I'm going to stay with you on this, and then Tridivesh, let me bring you in. Maybe just working back and generalizing a little bit about some of these, which often in disaster, they're sort of like rules changes or workarounds. They're improvised. And maybe they are not intended by policymakers. Maybe they're not even put in place by policymakers. They're enabled through certain emergency legislation. That's often the case in the United States. But which ones will stick? And I guess I'm asking you that question both in an empirical way, maybe in the case of Jordan or in India, but also maybe in a more theoretical, like how do we theorize that? Is there a way to predict? Will they be changes in the health sector or the waste sector, what we've just been talking about, or other kinds of new legal orders that can be brought in as a function of dealing with the pandemic? So I'm curious to get your take on that, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I've been a little bit surprised by the sort of, and this is like maybe this might be a little bit UK specific, but the tenacity with which people want to quote unquote, return to normal, right? So there's been this sort of very interesting, I think, almost denialism in the aftermath of the relaxing of restrictions to basically just sort of get rid of everything. And especially I think there's something about visual reminders of this kind of traumatic time that have been especially sort of targeted. So for instance, I've had people accost me for wearing a mask and sort of ask why I'm doing that, right? And sort of, well, why do you care, right? It's my business, right? But I think that maybe there's going to be more subtle ways in which the world is not going to go back to quote unquote normal. And I mean, again, I don't want to get in the prognostication business. I do think that one of the more interesting aspects of COVID, which I haven't necessarily seen so discussed, is how it just makes the movement of people and commodities more sticky, I guess, in a sense. And I guess you might have heard about the current problems with sort of labor shortages leading to problems with supply chains in the United Kingdom. But I think that this may be one of the areas in which we see a more permanent shift, which is just that the sort of the movement of goods and services is not necessarily going to return to pre-pandemic levels. I think that there's obviously a lot of motivation on the part of industry to sort of do that. But I do wonder if there's going to be a reassessment of globalization in the aftermath of all of this, that's not just going to go away so easily. And I think that may very well be underwritten by the fact that it's more subtle, it's less obvious. There are fewer constituencies that can basically exert pressure over it. Although, of course, to the degree that industry does depend on these just-in-time supply chains, obviously they have a big incentive to push back hard against this. But I also think that there may be ways in which the reassertion of basically the nation state in general and state power in particular may have some staying power. But I mean, again, right, I shouldn't be in the prognostication business, but that is one area where I don't see the rush back to normal as being so effortless. And it does seem like there's more friction there in terms of sort of undoing changes that have come in with the pandemic.
It's really interesting. Historians shouldn't be in the future telling business either, but let me go ahead and say that I've been thinking about these logistics issues too, and I think that to the extent that we might see something that looks like new laws or rules, they will be driven by the private sector, because so much of the global supply chain it may adhere to certain national rules and laws, but so much of it is governed actually by private governance and inter-industry organizations and private rule setting and regulation setting, that may be where we would look for some of the more profound changes coming out of the pandemic. I'm just thinking about the vaccine industry as one example. Certainly the paper industry would be another, and the food industry might be a third. Tritabesh, let me bring you back in. We've got a lot on the table here, but anything that you wanted to react to what we've been talking about, or specifically this issue of how sticky maybe some of these laws or rules or changes might be in India coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably probably just link back to this notion of binding crisis. And I think the pandemic almost forces us to think more systemically, probably think more about networks and associations and broader connections that provoke or deny certain changes. Let me be speculative. The pandemic took Trump out of power, and in the sense that how there's this multiple crisis that generates in its wake, not just a matter of public health, but also with economy. I know for sure that the Indian economy is kind of going through a bad patch right now. Of course, things will look up. That's because it has really been through a very lean patch, and things can only look better. But then we are, speaking to neighbors, relatives, and my parents who have been here and experienced this. There is rising inflation and there is unemployment, and of course, and I think the stickiness of things that Jeff just mentioned, the persistence of material remains, for example, plastics. It just it kind of is a visual reminder of all the ecological damages and not just economic challenges that we face. And probably this could be a moment to reevaluate political loyalties, and probably has something interesting for changes for politics and new kinds of societies and communities of solidarity to emerge. And I see that for sure in academia, for example, as you introduced, I'm in the final year of my PhD, and kind of this sudden stoppage of all kinds of, face-to-face scholarly social events was a challenge, but then it also inspired us to seek community elsewhere, online, for example. So, and I'm incredibly grateful for those. I'm sure all of us are. So, yeah, I guess to speculate and to look forward to hopefully more optimistic ways sharing ideas and coming together.
Let me stay with you on that, Tritabesh, because as you've said in the last year of your PhD, and I've talked with so many researchers who are either in that position like you are, or they've just started a new project and the pandemic intervenes and they've had to adapt their methods. And it's one thing it's hard enough for historians to adapt their methods. Not everybody thinks every archive has been fully digitized. Let me assure you, they have not been. But still, if we're not relying on ethnography or going into the field, there's a lot of work that can be done. And I despair for what anthropologists have been through in trying to keep up with ongoing sites, with trust networks that they work very hard to build. And then you have to adapt everything online. So I guess, Tritabesh, I don't know if you want to talk personally about how you had to adapt your method, or more generally, how you see yourself and colleagues doing digital ethnography, basically. What has it meant to you?
Me, personally, for my research, my so-called field work was already over much before the pandemic started. I was already writing up when the pandemic started. But I've of course seen I've had to fundamentally change their projects, because of course conceptual work is linked fundamentally to how we access data in more ethnographic research, in more ethnographic forms of producing knowledge. I think, let me probably also invite some reflection from Jeff, because I know that um, thought about and has spoken and written elsewhere about connections with the fields. Probably he will also be interested in saying something about this. But personally, for me, WhatsApp phone with a lot of my interlocutors and participants has been quite vital, not necessarily for data collection, but essentially as a form of keeping in touch and finding out how they're doing, if I can support in any way. So yeah, I mean, so more virtual forms of ongoing contact and replenishing trust networks for me.
Jeff, let me bring you in on that, kind of a final question or rumination from you, if you wouldn't mind. Anything around that, sort of your own projects just finished, new ones started, and how you see ethnography changing right now?
Yeah, so I mean, ironically enough, prior to the pandemic, I was planning a collaboration about what we called staying tuned and the kind of the changing nature of the ethnographic field. So this might be a good example of the pandemic as a binding crisis. And we actually recently published that in the journal Social Analysis, if anyone would like to read about that. And it was a series of, again, sort of different ethnographers from around the world discussing, how they're having to rethink the relationship between digital ethnography and what we used to quaintly refer to as ethnography in the real world. And I think that breakdown between the digital and the non-digital is something that was happening prior to the pandemic, but has been greatly accelerated by the pandemic. Now, what this actually means, of course, I think is that it's forcing a reckoning about how ethnographers gain their authority from, as has been theorized somewhat, I mean, not very poetically, this idea of quote unquote being there, right? But where is there now, right? And there's a sense in which I think for a lot of younger anthropologists, they're not going to get that initiatory rite of passage experience, of sort of going out to the quote unquote field and having these experiences in this liminal state, and then coming back and being slotted into the category of a professional anthropologist or ethnographer, sociologist, or whatever. Now, at the same time, I don't necessarily think that this means that their work is going to be any less rigorous or any less better. And in fact, I think in some ways, there are opportunities presented by the pandemic and the changing nature of communication. So one thing that I've been very interested in prior to the pandemic is how the people that anthropologists work with are increasingly resembling anthropologists insofar as they often are involved in their own projects of self-formation through various sorts of engagement with different publics and the attempt to sort of curate some sort of personal professional identity, but in relationship to different communities, right? And so in this sense, the pandemic has actually, I think, facilitated my relationships with people in Jordan in some very interesting ways. I mean, for one thing, people have just been very bored, right? And so when people are bored, they're more free for Skype calls. Their whole sort of orientation shifts, right? And so on the one hand, it's now actually quite easy for me to keep up with what's going on in Jordan without actually having to go anywhere or do anything. The flip side of this is something that I've been very frustrated with prior to the pandemic, which is that I used to go to relatively rural areas and people were just, they had nothing better to do than to talk to me, right? Because there wasn't anything else. And then they got their smartphones. And then all of a sudden it was like, well, there's a weird foreigner, but I have a million weird foreigners in my phone. What makes this weird foreigner particularly interesting, right? And so this made me kind of despair for the future of ethnography in certain ways. But I think that we're just going to have to, kind of roll with it. We're going to have to rethink what we actually mean by the field, what we mean by participation, and that this is going to ultimately just be something that we have to sort of innovate our way out of, And I think that again, sort of maybe thinking about this as a binding crisis and thinking about the changing norms around interaction and especially interaction on digital platforms has a lot of opportunities as well as the obvious drawbacks that have been brought about by the limitations on face-to-face interaction, problems with shared commensality, and increasingly, I think, and this is something, again, I think Tritabesh has really sensitized me to, the idea of the human body itself as a vector in the absence of, sort of the virus itself being visible or even a lot of socially spreads.
Just a quick, we're out of time. I just want a quick follow up on that, which is around the sort of ethical considerations, which I know must be part of training for any graduate student preparing to go into the field where the where is a place that you can point to on a map. But what do you see emerging, or maybe it had already emerged and it just not as many researchers were engaged with it, but in terms of what IRB institutional review boards are demanding, or what sort of code of ethics for anthropologists working at a distance, what have they brought to bear in coping with this digital distance that COVID has created?
Yeah, so in this piece in the introduction, I talk about this pre-pandemic experience of being memed as a sort of a Zionized spy of the American whatever with one of my interlocutors, and the way in which I received information of this via a WhatsApp message from my house in Exeter. So this kind of breakdown of identities and the ability to separate out what happens in the field from what happens at home, and the sort of the concerning ability of information to circulate between sort of the academy and our field sites, I think is already forcing us to rethink, ethics prior to all of this, right? So there's a way in which it used to be people could tell their darkest secrets to an anthropologist and they would effectively stay far away, but that's just not going to be possible anymore. So we have to rethink anonymity. We have to rethink informed consent, because oftentimes people are already themselves, in a certain sense, public figures or micro celebrities at the very least, but they may not understand how their behavior and opinions and sort of thoughts are going to be recontextualized somewhat radically if they are incorporated into social scientific research, even though they often may think that they understand the full risks. So yeah, I definitely think that that's something that was already going to be an issue pre-pandemic. And the pandemic, of course, is only going to exacerbate these really troubling ethical quandaries that we all have.
Just a reminder, you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can usually catch COVID Calls live at 6 p.m. Eastern Time weekdays. This is a special COVID Calls, which we had at 5:30 p.m. Korea time. And I just want to let you know the next COVID Calls episode will be at 5 p.m. Eastern Time Wednesday, which is less than 12 hours from now. So we've got a lot of time zones happening today on COVID Calls, and my next discussion will be on COVID in North Korea. So please do join me for that, 5 p.m. Eastern Time Wednesday. Let me thank my guests, Tritabesh Day and Jeffrey Hughes. This has been one of those conversations where it's like generated 1,000 ideas have sort of spun out of it, and a lot of things to follow up on, and I hope we'll keep in contact. Thanks for both of you for the work you're doing, the time you took in explaining it here today, and stay healthy. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Take care.
Okay, everyone, we'll see you next time on COVID Calls.